Welcome, and thank you for joining me in a quiet journey through time. Tonight, we wander through centuries and civilizations, exploring the small, often overlooked details that shaped the lives of ordinary people. From hidden gardens in ancient Texcoco to the uncelebrated artisans of Venice, and from the silent bell towers of medieval Europe to the slow, enduring work of Roman roads, we will trace the rhythms of labor, patience, and persistence that left lasting marks on history. This is a story not of battles or famous rulers, but of the quiet, methodical acts that shaped daily life, culture, and society. So, find a comfortable place, let your thoughts settle, and allow the gentle cadence of history to guide you as we explore the invisible threads of our shared past, one stone, one garden, one mask at a time. Asterisk. When the morning light deepens, Dionysus's stroll through the vineyard takes on new significance. It is no longer simply a quiet ritual, it is a form of teaching, both to mortals and, in the subtler sense, to himself. For the Greeks, observing the cycles of nature was not merely a practical matter. It was an ethical and spiritual exercise. Each vine, each branch, each carefully pruned shoot carries within it a lesson on patience, resilience, and attention. Dionysus, a god often associated with chaos, knew that these mundane moments held a quiet power, the power to transform life into something sustainable, enduring, and meaningful. The vineyard in which Dionysus walked was not merely a plot of land. It was an ecosystem, delicate. The vines grew best on terraces carved into hillsides, where water from seasonal rains could run slowly to nourish the roots. Stones had to be cleared so that they would not puncture clay jars or injure the workers' feet. Yet some stones were left intentionally as boundaries or markers. The careful balance between intervention and allowance mirrored the dual nature of Dionysus himself, a god who could both encourage growth and unleash disorder. Each morning, he would inspect the soil for signs of erosion, the leaves for evidence of disease, and the grapes for readiness. The practical knowledge required to interpret these signs was immense, and yet it was rarely spoken of in the myths. A damaged vine could mean weeks of lost labor. A sudden drought could threaten an entire season's work. The Greek farmers depended on subtle observation, and Dionysus, despite his divine nature, participated fully in these small acts of care. Here, he was no longer a god of spectacular epiphanies, but a quiet apprentice of time, seasons, and patience. The Greeks also understood that wine is more than a commodity. Wine was medicine, currency, offering, and social glue. Dionysus's attention to vineyard minutiae reflects a broader cultural awareness. Without diligence and attention to the ordinary, the extraordinary cannot exist. One cannot partake in the intoxicating delight of a festival if the grapes have failed to ripen. One cannot taste the subtle difference between early harvest and late harvest if the pruning has been neglected or the water mismanaged. Dionysus, walking among the vines, embodies this principle. Preparation precedes celebration, and order precedes chaos. It is worth noting that the ancient texts often describe the god's companions, maenads, and even nymphs joining him in the vineyards. Their presence might seem incongruous at first. After all, these creatures are often associated with exuberant, sometimes disruptive behavior. But in the early hours, they too participate quietly, learning the rhythms of growth. They untangle shoots, gather fallen leaves, and observe the ripening of grapes. Even the creatures of myth must learn patience and observation. The lesson here is subtle. The divine, the mythological, and the ordinary coexist, and each benefits from the other's presence. Sometimes, a single morning in the vineyard could reveal lessons about mortality and impermanence. Grapes rot if left unchecked, pests can ruin an entire plot, and storms can destroy the careful labor of months. Dionysus, walking among the terraces, was reminded that power alone cannot prevent loss. Even a god must recognize the constraints imposed by the natural world. And perhaps this is why he returned each dawn to reconnect with the inevitability of change, the necessity of attention, and the quiet rhythm that governs both mortals and immortals. The mythological texts also highlight the interplay between Dionysus and mortals. The god was known to wander from village to village, sometimes revealing the secrets of viticulture, sometimes offering encouragement to farmers weary from labor. In some versions, he demonstrates pruning techniques or instructs on the timing of harvest. These interactions were not dramatic in the way that Olympian interventions often were. They were subtle, often unrecorded, yet profoundly influential. Farmers might have thought themselves alone in their toil, unaware that a god walked beside them, guiding by example rather than command. One particularly telling story involves the village of Naxos. Here, Dionysus is said to have arrived during the early harvest season, not with fanfare, but with quiet observation. He noted the spacing of the vines, the composition of the soil, and the angles of the terraces. By the end of the week, the villagers reported improved yields and a subtle deepening in the flavor of their wine. Nothing spectacular occurred. There were no miracles, no visible displays of power. And yet this slow, methodical influence exemplifies the less recognized side of Dionysus, a god who teaches through diligence, patience, and the unnoticed rhythms of life. This also reflects the Greek understanding of divine multiplicity. Gods were not always singular in purpose or temperament. Dionysus could inspire both frenzied ecstasy and meticulous care. He could stir passion in a festival and demand focus in a vineyard. These seemingly opposite qualities coexist because the Greeks recognized that life itself is a balance of extremes. Just as the vine requires sunlight and shade, warmth and rain, celebration and quiet, so too did the god embody the full spectrum of existence, walking at dawn. Dionysus might also reflect on mortality in ways that most humans could not appreciate. For him, a season of grapes lasts decades, centuries even, if counted in the cycles of vineyards rather than human years. Yet, the impermanence of each fruit, each branch, reminded him that life, even divine life, is contingent. Perhaps this is why the myths describe him with a serene smile in the morning. He understands impermanence, accepts the quiet passage of time, and finds contentment in the simple act of observation. And still, the question lingers. One that the ancients rarely articulated, but the mind of a listener might dwell upon. If Dionysus, a god, walks quietly through the vineyards each morning, observing, learning, and guiding, how much of our own understanding of patience, diligence, and observation might come from such overlooked patterns? Are we, too, like these early morning vines, shaped quietly by forces we scarcely notice, awaiting the moment when our own efforts bear fruit, invisible yet significant. The myths leave the answer unresolved. Dionysus's dawn walks continue, season after season, year after year, a ritual both divine and ordinary. And perhaps it is in this quiet consistency, in the unnoticed care of earth and vine, that we glimpse the deepest lesson of all. Even in a life for a myth filled with chaos, there exists a rhythm, slow and deliberate, that nurtures all things, seen and unseen. When you imagine the gods of ancient Greece, you probably think of thundering Zeus on his storm cloud throne, or Athena standing tall with her spear and shield, dispensing wisdom and strategy to generals. But there is another god, softer in his movements, quieter in his habits, though still just as much a part of the divine household of Olympus. His name was Dionysus, and he was known to most as the god of wine, of festivals, of laughter, and of ecstatic dancing. Yet, if you look closer into the details, into the more neglected passages of his myth, you find that Dionysus was also a god who loved silence, routine, and especially the soft glow of vineyards at dawn. The myth of Dionysus is told in many versions. Some describe him as wild and chaotic, a god who swept through villages with his followers, the Maenads, overturning order in bursts of ecstatic frenzy. But other accounts, the quieter ones, often overlooked, tell of his gentler side. They describe how he preferred walking among the vines in the earliest hours of the morning, when the dew still clung to the grape leaves, and when the faint light of the rising sun softened the outlines of the hills. This side of Dionysus, less theatrical but no less divine, can seem almost boring to a modern listener, yet it reveals a great deal about how the ancients understood not just their gods, but their daily lives, to understand why Dionysus might prefer such a calm habit. You must picture the vineyard as it existed in ancient Greece. It was not the sprawling industrial enterprise that vineyards are today, but rather a patchwork of small holdings, often worked by families who passed down techniques generation to generation. The soil had to be carefully cleared of stones, terraces built on hillsides to prevent erosion, and every single vine planted by hand. It was not glamorous work. Farmers rose in the dim hours before dawn, just as Dionysus is said to have done, to inspect the vines for pests, to tie up the creeping shoots with simple twine, and to adjust the paths where water trickled down from springs or rainfall. Imagine yourself there, in one of these ancient vineyards. The air still carries the chill of night, though it is softening as the sun begins to climb. You hear the faint bleating of goats in the distance, tethered along the edges of the fields, their manure an unglamorous but essential fertilizer. The ground is dusty, and your sandals slip slightly as you climb up to a higher terrace. Around you, the vines stretch in ordered rows, each one carefully tended. And perhaps, if you believe the myths, you might imagine Dionysus walking there too, not as a roaring god with a crown of ivy, but as a quiet figure, breathing in the smell of crushed earth and dew-covered leaves. Dionysus was not always welcome among the other Olympians. His birth itself was unusual, even awkward. He was the son of Zeus and Semele, a mortal woman, which already made him something of an outsider. And when Hera, Zeus's wife, discovered the affair, her jealousy resulted in tragedy. Semele perished before Dionysus was born, and the infant had to be sewn into Zeus's thigh until he was ready to be born again. Such a strange beginning meant Dionysus always occupied an in-between place, not entirely divine, not entirely mortal. Perhaps it is this outsider status that made him more comfortable among the quiet vines than the loud banquets of Olympus. The Greeks themselves saw this duality in him. Yes, he was the god of theater, of ecstatic frenzy, of cities turning upside down in festival. But he was also the god of cultivation. He taught mortals how to grow grapes, how to press them, and how to ferment the juice into wine. Without his lessons, the vineyard would remain only a tangle of bitter fruit. With him, the vineyard became a source of livelihood, ritual, and social connection. And teaching these practical skills was hardly glamorous. It meant explaining when to prune branches, when to gather grapes, and how to store them in clay jars sealed with resin. These were boring details, but they mattered. Now, picture again that dawn walk through the vineyard. The farmers rise early, for the day will soon grow hot. They look at the clusters of grapes, weighing in their hands the firmness of the fruit. Is it time to harvest, or do they wait a few more days for the sugars to deepen? They adjust the reeds that hold the vines upright, straighten stones along the terrace walls, and mutter soft prayers to Dionysus. And perhaps, unseen but present, he walks with them, sharing their silence. It is worth noting that for the Greeks, the dawn itself had significance. Eos, the goddess of dawn, was said to rise from the ocean each morning, spreading rosy fingers of light across the sky. Dionysus walking at dawn meant he was moving in harmony with the cycles of time, not interrupting them. The work of the vineyard was never complete, always ongoing. Each year demanded new pruning, new planting, new harvests. Dionysus, in these quiet strolls, embodied the steady rhythm of agricultural life rather than the sudden spectacle of festival. Why did the Greeks preserve this quieter side of him at all, when they could have only remembered the more exciting festivals? Perhaps because they understood that ecstasy without routine cannot endure. The loud songs of the theater, the crash of cymbals, the wild dances of the Maenads, of these were real, but they had to be balanced by the steady, boring work of tending vines at dawn. Dionysus was both, and only by walking among the rows of grapes could he be understood fully. There is, of course, a paradox in a god of wine preferring silence at dawn. Wine is made for drinking, and drinking is rarely quiet. But consider this: every cup of wine begins in silence, in the slow growth of vines that need careful tending. Perhaps Dionysus's love for vineyard strolls is a reminder of that origin. Before the laughter, before the feast, before the drunken revels, there is the dew on leaves, the creak of branches, and the quiet inspection of fruit. And so, in the myths, Dionysus is sometimes described not as a loud intruder, but as a gentle guest. He arrives in a village, not with thunder, but with gifts, vines planted, jars filled, knowledge shared. The villagers, in turn, must decide whether to welcome him or to resist him. Those who resist usually suffer some strange fate, but those who welcome him often find their lives enriched. And perhaps, when they rise at dawn to walk through their vineyards, they feel he walks with them, even if unseen. Yet one wonders, was Dionysus's quiet love of dawn truly his nature? Or was it a balance against his more chaotic side? Did he find peace in those early walks, or did he merely prepare himself for the frenzy that would follow? Was he, even then, the same God who would later erupt in wild festivals, or was the dawn his refuge from it? As the sun rises higher, the vineyard transforms. Shadows retreat from the terraces, revealing the subtle textures of leaves, soil, and ripening grapes. By mid-morning, the labor of the early hours becomes evident. Workers have tended the vines, cleared the stones, tied up fragile shoots, and checked for signs of pests or disease. The vineyard now stands ready, a living mosaic of effort and care. For Dionysus, this moment quiet yet complete is its own kind of celebration. No music, no shouting, no dancing. Just the satisfaction of careful attention and the small perfection of routine. It is in these hours that the god's duality is most visible. Those who know only the wild festivals of Dionysus might find it difficult to reconcile him with this serene, orderly morning scene. Yet the ancients recognized that celebration takes many forms. One form is the loud, chaotic feast. Another is the steady, consistent work that makes that feast possible. Dionysus, walking through his vineyards, embodies both. His quiet joy in the ripening grapes is a reminder that even gods depend on patience and diligence, and that even ecstasy requires a foundation of preparation. In some accounts, Dionysus would pause beside a particular vine, cupping the ripest cluster of grapes in his hands. He would inspect it for color, firmness, and sweetness, turning the fruit carefully so that light falls evenly upon it. Then he might pluck one, taste it, and nod in approval, not because the mortal world demanded it, but because he found satisfaction in this small, precise act. Such moments are almost invisible in the larger narrative of Greek mythology. Yet they reveal a profound truth. Attention to ordinary details is a form of devotion, a quiet expression of power and care. It is worth noting that these quiet rituals also carried lessons for mortals. Farmers, witnessing a god move with such care and patience, were reminded of their own responsibility to the land. Dionysus's presence, even if subtle, reinforced the idea that the ordinary, repetitive work of tending vineyards was itself sacred. The Greeks believed that humans and gods could participate together in the cycles of nature, each fulfilling roles that complemented the other. The gods' careful inspection of the vines elevated mundane labor into something meaningful, even spiritual. Yet the myths rarely dwell on these morning rituals. They prefer the spectacle of festivals, the dance of the Maenads, the chaos of intoxicated revelry. But the quieter tales endure in fragments, in obscure texts, and fleeting references. They tell of Dionysus teaching mortals the techniques of viticulture, showing them how to layer terraces, prune shoots, and preserve the harvest. These stories suggest that gods, like humans, find value in repetition, in routine, and in the slow accumulation of effort. They hint at the notion that even divine life contains boring hours when no one cheers, when no story is sung. But when the world quietly sustains itself, the vineyard itself becomes a character in these stories. Its slopes, terraces, and rows mirror the god's personality, orderly yet capable of wild growth, predictable yet capable of surprise. Each season, the cycle repeats: pruning, growth, ripening, harvest. Dionysus walks these terraces as a participant, not an overlord, aligning himself with the rhythm of the earth. There is a subtle moral here. Power is not only in spectacle or decree, but in understanding and participating in the quiet processes that sustain life. And perhaps there is a deeper lesson hidden in these routines. Wine, after all, is the product of transformation over time. Grapes ferment slowly, taking on flavors shaped by climate, soil, and patient human care. Dionysus, by walking among the vines at dawn, witnesses the slow alchemy of life itself. He sees that patience produces sweetness, that attention produces abundance, and that the ordinary, when respected, can become extraordinary. The god of chaos also understands order. The god of ecstasy also respects discipline. As you imagine Dionysus in the soft morning light, it is worth considering the lasting impact of these quiet acts. Every festival, every joyous cup of wine is made possible by the hours he spent walking among the vines. Every story of wild revelry owes its existence to the subtle lessons embedded in routine and observation. In other words, the seemingly boring details, the tying of shoots, the careful pruning, the inspection of each grape shape, the world in ways both practical and symbolic. Yet, even in these calm hours, the myths leave room for contemplation. Did Dionysus ever tire of the quiet? Did he long for the roar of festival even as he walked alone? Was he aware that the lives of mortals, and even the unfolding of nature itself, depended on his dual presence, both wild and disciplined, chaotic and patient? The texts offer no answer. They simply record that he walked, that he observed, that he nurtured, and that the cycles of growth continued uninterrupted. And so, as the sun rises fully over the vineyard and the morning labor concludes, we are left with a final reflection. Dionysus's love of quiet vineyard strolls is not merely a quaint mythic detail. It is a meditation on the value of patience, the sacredness of routine, and the subtle ways in which care transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. Every grape he inspects, every terrace he walks, embodies a truth that the ancients understood well. Life's sweetness is often the product of unnoticed, persistent effort, and even the most extraordinary beings must respect the slow rhythms of the world they inhabit. The next time you imagine Dionysus, the god of wine and frenzy, picture him instead at dawn, walking softly between rows of grapevines, the dew clinging to leaves, the air cool and still. And perhaps you will understand why even a god, in his infinite nature, valued the simple, unhurried moments of quiet observation above all else. As the sun rises higher, the vineyard transforms. Shadows retreat from the terraces, revealing the subtle textures of leaves, soil, and ripening grapes. By mid-morning, the labor of the early hours becomes evident. Workers have tended the vines, cleared the stones, tied up fragile shoots, and checked for signs of pests or disease. The vineyard now stands ready, a living mosaic of effort and care. For Dionysus, this moment quiet yet complete is its own kind of celebration. No music, no shouting, no dancing. Just the satisfaction of careful attention and the small perfection of routine. It is in these hours that the god's duality is most visible. Those who know only the wild festivals of Dionysus might find it difficult to reconcile him with this serene, orderly morning scene. Yet the ancients recognized that celebration takes many forms. One form is the loud, chaotic feast. Another is the steady, consistent work that makes that feast possible. Dionysus, walking through his vineyards, embodies both. His quiet joy in the ripening grapes is a reminder that even gods depend on patience and diligence, and that even ecstasy requires a foundation of preparation. In some accounts, Dionysus would pause beside a particular vine, cupping the ripest cluster of grapes in his hands. He would inspect it for color, firmness, and sweetness, turning the fruit carefully so that light falls evenly upon it. Then he might pluck one, taste it, and nod in approval, not because the mortal world demanded it, but because he found satisfaction in this small, precise act. Such moments are almost invisible in the larger narrative of Greek mythology. Yet they reveal a profound truth. Attention to ordinary details is a form of devotion, a quiet expression of power and care. It is worth noting that these quiet rituals also carried lessons for mortals. Farmers, witnessing a god move with such care and patience, were reminded of their own responsibility to the land. Dionysus's presence, even if subtle, reinforced the idea that the ordinary, repetitive work of tending vineyards was itself sacred. The Greeks believed that humans and gods could participate together in the cycles of nature, each fulfilling roles that complemented the other. The gods' careful inspection of the vines elevated mundane labor into something meaningful, even spiritual. Yet the myths rarely dwell on these morning rituals. They prefer the spectacle of festivals, the dance of the Maenads, the chaos of intoxicated revelry. But the quieter tales endure in fragments, in obscure texts, and fleeting references. They tell of Dionysus teaching mortals the techniques of viticulture, showing them how to layer terraces, prune shoots, and preserve the harvest. These stories suggest that gods, like humans, find value in repetition, in routine, and in the slow accumulation of effort. They hint at the notion that even divine life contains boring hours when no one cheers, when no story is sung. But when the world quietly sustains itself, the vineyard itself becomes a character in these stories. Its slopes, terraces, and rows mirror the god's personality, orderly yet capable of wild growth, predictable yet capable of surprise. Each season, the cycle repeats: pruning, growth, ripening, harvest. Dionysus walks these terraces as a participant, not an overlord, aligning himself with the rhythm of the earth. There is a subtle moral here. Power is not only in spectacle or decree, but in understanding and participating in the quiet processes that sustain life. And perhaps there is a deeper lesson hidden in these routines. Wine, after all, is the product of transformation over time. Grapes ferment slowly, taking on flavors shaped by climate, soil, and patient human care. Dionysus, by walking among the vines at dawn, witnesses the slow alchemy of life itself. He sees that patience produces sweetness, that attention produces abundance, and that the ordinary, when respected, can become extraordinary. The god of chaos also understands order. The god of ecstasy also respects discipline. As you imagine Dionysus in the soft morning light, it is worth considering the lasting impact of these quiet acts. Every festival, every joyous cup of wine is made possible by the hours he spent walking among the vines. Every story of wild revelry owes its existence to the subtle lessons embedded in routine and observation. In other words, the seemingly boring details, the tying of shoots, the careful pruning, the inspection of each grape shape, the world in ways both practical and symbolic. Yet, even in these calm hours, the myths leave room for contemplation. Did Dionysus ever tire of the quiet? Did he long for the roar of festival even as he walked alone? Was he aware that the lives of mortals, and even the unfolding of nature itself, depended on his dual presence, both wild and disciplined, chaotic and patient? The texts offer no answer. They simply record that he walked, that he observed, that he nurtured, and that the cycles of growth continued uninterrupted. And so, as the sun rises fully over the vineyard and the morning labor concludes, we are left with a final reflection. Dionysus's love of quiet vineyard strolls is not merely a quaint mythic detail. It is a meditation on the value of patience, the sacredness of routine, and the subtle ways in which care transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. Every grape he inspects, every terrace he walks, embodies a truth that the ancients understood well. Life's sweetness is often the product of unnoticed, persistent effort, and even the most extraordinary beings must respect the slow rhythms of the world they inhabit. The next time you imagine Dionysus, the god of wine and frenzy, picture him instead at dawn, walking softly between rows of grapevines, the dew clinging to leaves, the air cool and still, and perhaps you will understand why even a god in his infinite nature valued the simple, unhurried moments of quiet observation above all else. In the bustling city of Athens, long before the philosophers began their contemplations in the shaded groves of the Agora, and before the great Parthenon rose on the Acropolis, there existed a quieter, often overlooked world, the world of artisans. These were the men and women who shaped clay, hammered bronze, carved wood, and chiseled marble. They were not celebrated in myths or praised in songs. Their lives, meticulous and methodical, were largely invisible to history. Yet without them, the grandeur of Athens could never have existed. Consider the potters first. The city's clay workshops, often located just outside the main thoroughfares, to minimize dust and smoke, were suffused with the earthy scent of wet clay and the sharp tang of firing kilns. Early in the morning, before the agora stirred with merchants and citizens, potters would mix their clay, kneading it carefully to remove air bubbles and ensure uniform consistency. Each coil and slab was handled with precision, the potter's hands shaping vessels that ranged from simple storage jars to elaborately painted amphorae depicting mythic scenes. To an observer, these tasks may have seemed mundane, repetitive, even boring. Yet, in this quiet labor, the foundations of Athenian culture were being laid. Potters often signed their work, but these signatures were modest marks on the base, almost a whisper of authorship rather than a claim to fame. Unlike the gods and heroes depicted in the decorations, the artisans themselves remained in the shadows, their daily routines unnoticed by the crowds that would later purchase and use their creations. In these workshops, apprentices learned the delicate balance of water, clay, and time, honing their skill through long hours of repetition. Mistakes were costly. A collapsed vase meant days of effort lost, kilns wasted, and resources squandered. Parallel to the potters were the bronze workers. Their studios were darker, the air filled with metallic tangs and the heat from furnaces that could reach unimaginable temperatures. Here, molten bronze was poured into molds, cooled, and then meticulously polished. Every figurine, every ceremonial shield, required painstaking effort. The bronze itself demanded patience. It resisted shaping and punished carelessness. Workers often labored for months on a single piece, the repetitive hammering and filing forming a rhythm akin to meditation. These artisans were rarely mentioned in the stories of war and conquest, but they supplied the very tools that would protect Athens in battle. Even the marble carvers, those who would eventually contribute to the grand temples and statues of the Acropolis, lived lives of quiet discipline. They extracted slabs from quarries far outside the city, often at great personal risk. Each slab was then transported, slowly, carefully, to workshops where chisels, mallets, and measuring tools transformed the raw stone into form and contour. Every detail mattered. The slightest miscalculation could ruin a piece entirely. For years, carvers honed their craft in relative obscurity, their names known only to fellow workers and a few local patrons. What makes these artisans particularly fascinating is not merely their skill, but their methods. The Greeks were meticulous in recording proportions, not in words, but in practice. Apprentices learned through observation, repetition, and subtle guidance from masters whose temperaments varied from patient to severe. Mistakes were teachers. Each flawed piece offered insight into the delicate balance of material, tool, and human effort. There was an unspoken reverence for the process itself, a sense that mastery was achieved not through flash or recognition, but through disciplined repetition day after day. Daily life for these artisans was dictated by the sun and the seasons. Potters had to be careful during damp weather, as clay could spoil. Bronze workers needed constant airflow in the hot months. Marble carvers timed their quarrying to avoid the heat of midsummer. Every task required careful observation of natural conditions, a skill often overlooked by historians in favor of dramatic events and monumental achievements. In this attention to detail lies a form of quiet Dionysus, steady, persistent shaping of both material and culture. Even their social lives were intertwined with their labor. Workshops often doubled as homes or community spaces where families worked together. Children observed, learned, and contributed from a young age, often taking on tasks such as grinding pigments, polishing small bronze objects, or fetching water for the kilns. The work was monotonous, yet these early experiences instilled not only skill but a sense of rhythm and purpose. Forming the backbone of Athens's material culture, religious life also intersected with artisan labor in understated ways. Many workshops featured small shrines or icons dedicated to Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship, and Athena, who oversaw wisdom and skill. These shrines were rarely elaborate, but they reminded workers that their daily efforts were observed and, in a subtle way, sanctified. Each vase fired, each bronze figurine polished, each chisel mark in marble was an offering of precision and dedication, an acknowledgement of the unseen divine order that infused ordinary labor with meaning. Yet, for all the care and dedication, these artisans were vulnerable. Market fluctuations could leave them unpaid. Wars could halt production. and political changes could redirect patronage elsewhere. Their lives were precarious, dependent on demand and reputation. Yet they persisted, day after day, through long hours of repetition and quiet focus. It is perhaps this enduring commitment to the unremarkable routines of daily life that makes their story remarkable in its own understated way. And so, as you imagine a typical morning in an Athenian workshop, consider the stillness, the quiet scratching of a chisel against marble, the rhythmic spinning of a potter's wheel, the steady heat of a bronze furnace. These are not moments that thrill the imagination in the same way as tales of gods or battles. Yet, they reveal a foundational truth about history. Great achievements are often built on repetitive, unnoticed labor, shaped by people who leave little trace of themselves in the annals of legend. The question remains, one that history leaves unresolved. How much of Athens's grandeur depended on these quiet artisans? And how much might have been lost had their careful routines faltered? Could the Parthenon, the bronze statues, the painted amphorae exist without the patient, day-to-day dedication of those whose names we will never know? And, in imagining these quiet figures, what lessons might we draw for our own understanding of diligence, craft, and the unnoticed acts that shape the world around us? As the day unfolds in ancient Athens, the rhythm of artisan life continues, steady and unremarkable to the casual observer, yet vital to the functioning of the city. By mid-morning, the workshops are alive with a mixture of sounds, the steady thrum of the potter's wheel, the metallic ringing of hammer on bronze, the sharp chisel biting into marble. It is not the roar of the agora or the fanfare of religious festivals. It is quieter, almost meditative, but it is essential. The city itself, magnificent as it appears to the historian or traveler, owes its physical and cultural beauty to these hours of uninterrupted labor. For the potters, the work progresses in precise stages. Clay, having been kneaded and allowed to rest, is shaped into vessels of varying forms. Some are utilitarian, intended for storage or transport of grain, wine, and oil. Others are more decorative, adorned with motifs drawn from myth, history, or daily life. The decoration is painstaking. A slip-a-thin layer of liquid clay must be applied evenly. Brushes held delicately to trace figures that tell a story without words. Once dried, these pieces are fired in kilns, where careful attention to temperature determines whether a vase will survive intact or shatter into fragments. Even minor deviations in the firing process could ruin weeks of meticulous work. Meanwhile, bronze workshops operate under entirely different constraints, yet demand the same rigorous discipline. Workers must monitor furnaces with unwavering attention, tending to molten metal at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Molds are prepared with precision. Clay, wax, and sand are layered in careful order to receive the bronze. Pouring is a moment fraught with danger and possibility. A misstep can result in injury, loss of valuable metal, or deformation of the intended piece. After cooling, the artisan spends hours grinding, filing, and polishing the metal, gradually revealing the intended form. Each object, whether a votive figure, a ceremonial weapon, or a small decorative pieces, a testament to patience and skill rather than the flash of public attention. Marble carving, too, demands endurance and nuance. Quarrying marble from Mount Pentelicus, or Mount Hymettus is physically exhausting, requiring teams of laborers to cut slabs and transport them long distances. Once in the workshop, carvers work methodically, measuring, marking, and chiseling with precision. They learn the properties of different marble, how it responds to pressure, how light interacts with its surface, and how to minimize cracks. Even minor imperfections require ingenuity to correct. Apprentices spend years observing, learning the feel of the chisel, the rhythm of hammer strikes, and the subtleties of stone grain. Mistakes are public in a limited sense. The flawed piece may be seen by a patron, but often the failures remain unseen, buried in piles of discarded stone or kill shards. Life for these artisans extended beyond labor. Families often shared living space with the workshop, blending domestic routines with professional training. Children learned early the skills and disciplines that would sustain their families, contributing to the work while absorbing the unspoken rhythms of craft. Social hierarchies existed even within these spaces. Master artisans guided apprentices, who in turn supervised novices or younger siblings. Patience and attention were rewarded with incremental responsibilities, fostering a culture of mentorship that endured across generations. The city itself imposed additional rhythms, religious observances, civic duties, and seasonal festivals, all punctuated the quiet routines of the workshop. During the Panathenaea or other processions, artisans might contribute by crafting ceremonial objects, weaving banners, or adorning temples. Even these contributions, though visible to the public, were extensions of the daily meticulous work already ingrained in their practice. Their labor, integrated into broader civic and religious life, subtly shaped Athens's identity. Though the artisans themselves rarely received recognition beyond their immediate circles, economic considerations also influenced daily routines. The cost of materials, clay, marble, bronze, pigments was significant, and artisans carefully managed resources to minimize waste. Fluctuations in demand could affect income, with periods of scarcity requiring frugality and ingenuity. Contracts with wealthy patrons dictated deadlines, shapes, and finishes, leaving little room for improvisation. Yet within these constraints, the skilled artisan found opportunity for subtle innovation, a unique brushstroke, a slightly different engraving, or a novel approach to mold design. Creativity was exercised quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it contributed meaningfully to the evolution of Greek art and culture. Even the environment shaped their work in unnoticed ways. Workshops were often located near sources of water for clay preparation, fuel for kilns, or access to quarries and markets. Noise, temperature, and light influenced the pace of labor, dictating rest breaks or shifts in method. The artisans adapted continuously, learning not just their craft but the ways in which material, place, and weather interacted. These small adaptations, while unremarkable on the surface, accumulated over time into an intimate understanding of materials and process that only experience could teach in quiet reflection. The artisans were also observers of human behavior. Markets, festivals, and civic spaces provided constant lessons in aesthetics, utility, and preference. Potters noted which shapes sold best. Bronze workers saw the forms that patrons valued. Carvers recognized the proportions that inspired. Through daily labor, they were not just shaping materials, they were shaping taste, subtly influencing the cultural memory of Athens. Every vessel, figurine, and sculpture carried lessons for generations. Even if the hands that created them remained anonymous, yet, in all this, an unresolved question persists, one that history rarely addresses. To what extent did the unnoticed diligence of these artisans underpin Athens's reputation as a center of civilization? Without their quiet labor, would philosophers still have debated, temples still inspired devotion, and the city itself achieved renown? Their lives, measured in repetitive gestures and attentive care, remind us that history is not only made by the loud, the famous, or the heroic. Often it is shaped by persistence, discipline, and the mundane acts of those who rarely step into the light. As the sun begins its descent over Athens, the day's labor reaches its quiet conclusion. Workshops settle into a hushed rhythm. The potter cleans clay-streaked hands and wheels. Bronze workers scrape soot from furnaces, and marble carvers wipe dust from their tools. The work has been completed for the day, yet the fruits of their effort remain visible in the forms they have coaxed from raw materials. Every vessel, every figurine, every slab of carved stone stands as testimony to both diligence and the unseen persistence of human skill. The artisan's influence extended far beyond the walls of their workshops. Every amphora that traveled to markets, every bronze shield that adorned a ceremonial procession, every marble frieze that graced a temple contributed to the broader cultural fabric of Athens. Yet this influence was subtle. Unlike the poets, generals, or philosophers whose names were recorded in texts, the artisan's presence was tangible but largely anonymous. Their labor shaped daily life and civic identity without demanding attention or acclaim. In this quiet, their work became a foundation upon which the celebrated achievements of Athens rested. Consider the pottery workshops. By producing both functional and decorative vessels, potters shaped the domestic and ritual life of the city. Storage jars preserved grain and oil, facilitating trade and sustenance, while decorated amphorae recorded stories, commemorated victories, and displayed mythic imagery. The act of creating these vessels involved not only technical skill, but also cultural literacy, the ability to encode stories and symbols that could be understood and appreciated by users. Each brushstroke, each geometric motif was a whisper of tradition, a subtle reinforcement of collective memory. Bronze workers similarly left enduring legacies. Shields, votive offerings, figurines, and tools reflected not only their mastery of metal, but also the values and aesthetics of their society. The perfection of a bronze figure, its balance and form, influenced the perception of divinity and heroism, even if the artisan's name remained unknown. Bronze demanded patience and precision. One miscast could ruin weeks of effort. Yet the artisans persisted, contributing to a body of work that inspired awe and admiration for generations. Often without recognition, marble carvers, too, played a foundational role in Athens's visual and spiritual landscape. The grand temples, friezes, and statues that define the city were the product of countless hours of meticulous labor. Every curve, every proportion, and every detail was calculated to reflect balance, harmony, and reverence. Apprentices learned not only techniques, but also judgment, perception, and an understanding of how art interacts with light, space, and human experience. Through repetition and careful observation, the carvers instilled values of discipline and subtlety into the culture itself. Yet the lives of these artisans were not defined solely by labor. Their work created social cohesion, family continuity, and apprenticeship networks that allowed knowledge to persist across generations. Children absorbed lessons silently, watching and imitating, learning to anticipate materials, behavior, and the needs of patrons. Community rituals sometimes intertwined with daily tasks, reinforcing both skill and cultural understanding. In essence, the artisans were both preservers and transmitters of cultural heritage, sustaining Athens's identity in ways largely invisible to history. The quiet persistence of these craftsmen also illustrates the balance between necessity and creativity. While much of their work was dictated by functional demands or patron preferences, within these boundaries existed opportunities for subtle innovation, a unique pattern, a slight variation in shape, or a new approach to mold making. Creativity was exercised carefully, almost imperceptibly, but it contributed to the evolution of Athenian art, shaping tastes and influencing future generations. The city's celebrated achievements, its architecture, pottery, and metalwork depended upon this delicate interplay between routine and invention. As the evening settles, the workshops grow silent, leaving only traces of their presence in the objects that remain. The city continues to bustle around them, with marketplaces, public speeches, and philosophical debates taking center stage. Yet the artisan's influence endures quietly, woven into the objects that populate homes, temples, and civic spaces. Their labor, repetitive and largely unseen, enabled the cultural flourishing that history celebrates. And so we are left with reflection. The greatest accomplishments often rest on invisible foundations. The artisans of Athens remind us that persistence, discipline, and careful attention to the mundane are as crucial to civilization as the exploits of heroes and philosophers. Without their daily efforts, the Parthenon would not inspire wonder. The agora would lack the vessels and tools that facilitated life, and Greek art would be incomplete. Their quiet, methodical work is a testimony to human resilience and creativity, even when it remains unrecognized. History leaves us with an unresolved question, one that echoes across time. How many great societies owe their splendor to unseen hands, to individuals whose names are lost but whose labor endures? In considering the forgotten artisans of Athens, we glimpse a truth both humble and profound. It is often the unnoticed dedication of ordinary people that shapes the extraordinary achievements of civilization. In the ancient city of Alexandria, where the shimmering Mediterranean kissed the bustling port, there existed a quieter, often invisible world, the world of scribes. These were the men and women who labored tirelessly in dimly lit rooms, preserving the knowledge of Egypt, Greece, and beyond. While the city dazzled with its grand library, its towering lighthouse, and its crowded marketplaces, the scribes moved in silence, translating, copying, and cataloging scrolls by candlelight or the weak glow of oil lamps. Their work was monotonous and repetitive, yet indispensable. Without them, the vast repository of knowledge housed in the Library of Alexandria would have remained fragmented, lost to the vagaries of time. The life of a scribe was defined by painstaking attention to detail. Papyrus sheets, fragile and susceptible to moisture, were carefully prepared and smoothed to create an even surface for writing. Ink, made from soot, gum, and water, had to be mixed with precision to ensure that it flowed consistently from reed pens. Every letter, every accent, and every diacritical mark mattered, for a single error could change the meaning of an entire text. The work was repetitive, often isolating, and the room was filled not with noise or festivity, but with the quiet scratching of pen against papyrus. Scribes were entrusted with a wide variety of texts: philosophical treatises, medical manuals, religious works, mathematical treatises, and astronomical records. Each required specialized knowledge. A medical text demanded understanding of anatomy and remedies. A mathematical treatise required precision in numbers and symbols. Scribes often consulted with scholars or elders to ensure accuracy, yet much of their labor remained unseen, a silent bridge between minds across generations. The environment in which scribes worked also shaped their routines. Alexandria was a vibrant, noisy city, full of merchants, sailors, and scholars. Yet inside the library or in private scriptoriums, the atmosphere was hushed. Light was scarce, with windows small and often shuttered to protect scrolls from sun damage. Oil lamps produced heat and smoke that could be uncomfortable but were necessary to illuminate the workspace. The air was scented faintly with papyrus, ink, and the occasional perfume used to counteract odors. Each scribe adapted to these conditions, developing techniques for steady writing, careful page turning, and meticulous correction. Apprenticeships were common. Young learners would spend years under the guidance of a master scribe, observing the careful strokes, learning the proper handling of materials, and practicing copying texts until accuracy became second nature. Errors were corrected with patience, often by scraping ink from papyrus and rewriting the text. Precision, not speed, was paramount. In this environment, repetition became a form of meditation, a slow and deliberate engagement with knowledge itself. The scribe's work also had a broader social and cultural purpose. By preserving texts, they facilitated the exchange of ideas across regions and generations. Scholars could consult copies without needing direct access to the original works. Information about distant civilizations, their practices, and their inventions traveled on the hands of these quiet workers. Without the scribe's diligence, the discoveries and observations of countless thinkers might have vanished entirely. Yet, despite their importance, scribes were largely invisible in historical accounts. They were neither celebrated nor dramatized. The tales of great philosophers, explorers, and rulers overshadowed the slow, methodical work of copying texts and correcting errors. Still, the scribe's labor created the foundation for what we now recognize as the intellectual legacy of Alexandria. The library, grand as it was, depended entirely on their care, precision, and commitment to routine. Even in mundane moments, scribes shaped the future. The order in which texts were stored, the clarity of handwriting, the preservation of rare works all influenced whether knowledge survived or deteriorated. Scribes learned to anticipate the fragility of papyrus, the inconsistencies of ink, and the threats posed by humidity, pests, and careless handling. their work required both foresight and patience, and their success was measured in subtle signs: a scroll that remained intact after years, a formula correctly reproduced, a narrative preserved without distortion. And yet, the life of a scribe was not entirely solitary or devoid of wonder. Interaction with texts brought glimpses into the minds of distant thinkers. The methods of mathematicians, the medical insights of physicians, and the philosophies of cultures long gone. Each copied line connected the scribe to centuries of human thought, a continuous chain of knowledge maintained through careful repetition by night. When the city slept and the streets of Alexandria were silent, the scribes continued their work, their lamplight flickering against the walls lined with scrolls. There was a rhythm to their labor, a quiet cadence that mirrored the passage of time itself. It was both tiresome and transcendent, a bridge between the ephemeral present and the enduring legacy of ideas. And so, one must wonder, in a city renowned for its grandeur and spectacle, how much of Alexandria's enduring influence rested not on rulers, scholars, or monumental architecture, but on the quiet, repetitive, meticulous work. How many ideas survived, and how many were lost, simply because of the carelessness of these unseen custodians of knowledge. As the night deepens in Alexandria, the work of the scribes continues, uninterrupted by the distractions of city life. The markets have closed, the streets are quiet, and the port lies still under the silver light of the moon. Inside the script, only the faint scratching of reeds on papyrus breaks the silence. These nocturnal hours are not marked by spectacle or recognition. They are defined by focus, patience, and an almost meditative repetition of task. Yet within this quiet, the scribes carry the weight of civilizations. Each scroll handled by a scribe is a fragile vessel of human thought. Philosophical arguments, astronomical observations, medical treatises, and poetic compositions arrive in Alexandria from across the Mediterranean, each requiring careful transcription. The scribe must be vigilant. A single miswritten word can alter meaning, a misaligned number can disrupt a calculation, a smudged line can obscure a metaphor. Mistakes are not just errors, they are potential ruptures in the chain of knowledge. This awareness presses upon the scribes, yet they work with a steady rhythm, learning to trust the repetitive nature of their craft. Scribes also perform the delicate task of translating texts. Many scrolls arrive in Egyptian, Greek, or Hebrew, requiring interpretation before they can be copied. This is painstaking work. Words carry subtleties of culture, context, and intention. A mistranslation could lead to misrepresentation of thought, and yet the scribe's hand is meant to be invisible. The goal is not to create anew, but to preserve faithfully. In this quiet tension between fidelity and skill, the scribe becomes both observer and guardian, a silent mediator between the original author and future readers. Apprenticeship dominates daily life. Young learners spend hours copying simple texts, practicing letter forms, and familiarizing themselves with the materials. Master scribes correct their work with patient hands, pointing out inconsistencies and guiding attention to nuance. Errors are neither celebrated nor chastised excessively. They are treated as learning opportunities. Gradually, apprentices internalize the discipline required to produce accurate copies. learning to anticipate the demands of the material, the medium, and the message. This slow accumulation of expertise is vital to the longevity of the library's collection. The physical space of the scriptorium also shapes their work. Rooms are often dark, lined with shelves of scrolls stacked meticulously. Light is limited, sometimes augmented with small oil lamps that produce both warmth and smoke. Dust settles on surfaces, requiring constant care. Papyrus sheets are delicate, and even the handling of multiple scrolls in succession can lead to wear. Scribes must develop dexterity, patience, and attentiveness, often using small weights or supports to prevent curling or tearing. Every motion is calculated, measured, and deliberate choreography of preservation. Beyond the mechanics of copying and translation, the scribes interact with ideas in profound ways. Repetition allows them to internalize content, forming a quiet understanding of mathematical proofs, medicinal recipes, and philosophical arguments. Though their role is not creative in the conventional sense, they are intimately connected with the evolution of thought, observing how ideas are recorded, preserved, and ordered. The scribes participate in the intellectual life of the city without ever stepping into the public eye. Social and political dynamics also influence their labor. Patronage determines which texts are copied, preserved, or neglected. Wars, economic instability, and shifts in ruling authority can disrupt the delicate rhythm of transcription. Yet the scribes persist, maintaining continuity in the face of uncertainty. Their dedication ensures that knowledge, often precariously housed in fragile papyrus, survives beyond the immediate demands of rulers or scholars. Even as their work continues night after night, the scribe's presence is largely invisible. They are overshadowed by philosophers, rulers, and the grandeur of Alexandria's architectural achievements. Yet it is through their diligence that the intellectual foundations of the ancient world endure. Without their methodical care, many works of literature, science, and philosophy might have been lost entirely. Each careful stroke, each faithfully copied line, becomes a quiet act of preservation that resonates across centuries. And yet, an unresolved question lingers. How much knowledge was lost despite their tireless labor? How many voices of antiquity? What ideas and insights never reached the hands of future generations because a scribe miscopied a number, a letter, or a word? The library's glory, immense though it was always fragile, dependent on the quiet, repetitive diligence of those whose names were rarely remembered. The midnight scribes teach us that history is not only shaped by the celebrated or the powerful, but by the quiet persistence of those who labor unseen. Their work is a testament to endurance, meticulous care, and the patient transmission of culture. The world we inherit owes much to these shadows among scrolls, whose influence is subtle yet profound, whose stories remain mostly untold, yet whose legacy endures in every preserved thought from antiquity. As the first light of dawn touches the rooftops of Alexandria, the scribes pause from their nocturnal labors. Scrolls have been carefully stacked, ink has dried, and the faint scent of papyrus and soot lingers in the cool morning air. Though unseen by most of the city, these scribes have spent hours, or even the entire night, ensuring that knowledge survives, patiently transferring wisdom from one generation to the next. In these quiet hours, their labor seems almost sacred, a deliberate act of guardianship over human thought. The scribe's work was more than mechanical reproduction. It was a form of stewardship. Each carefully copied scroll, each precise line of text, was a safeguard against forgetfulness, decay, and chaos. Without their discipline, the philosophical musings of Plato, the mathematical treatises of Euclid, and the observations of astronomers like Aristarchus might have vanished entirely. Their influence was subtle, largely invisible, but it was enduring. The knowledge they preserved would travel far beyond Alexandria, influencing societies for centuries to come. It is important to recognize the risks and challenges of their work. Papyrus is delicate and easily damaged. Ink can smudge or fade. Fires, floods, and invasions threatened to destroy the very texts the scribes labored to preserve. In addition, political upheavals and shifting patronage could suddenly alter which works were deemed valuable, leaving some knowledge neglected. Yet the scribes persisted, motivated by a quiet understanding of their role as custodians of culture. Every careful stroke of ink was an act of resistance against time and entropy. Even more remarkable is the extent to which these scribes internalized the knowledge they copied. Through repetition, they absorbed ideas, patterns, and methods, developing an intimate familiarity with the content. In a sense, each scribe became a living repository of information, connecting past wisdom to the present moment. Though their names rarely entered the historical record, their intellectual imprint was profound, shaping the trajectory of science, philosophy, and art long after Alexandria itself fell into decline. Some records suggest that scribes developed systems to organize the growing collection of texts. Scrolls were arranged by subject, author, and sometimes even by method of composition. Marginal notes, cross-references, and indexes allowed for more efficient retrieval of information, reflecting not only their diligence but also their foresight. These small, methodical acts of organization ensured that knowledge remained accessible, and their impact persisted in libraries and archives for centuries. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the scribe's labor is the value of consistency and care in shaping the future. While public attention often celebrates spectacle, power, or conquest, the survival of knowledge depends on patience, repetition, and precision. Each unassuming scribe, working silently through the night, contributed to a legacy that transcended personal recognition. Their influence was cumulative, invisible in the short term, yet transformative over time. And yet, an unresolved reflection emerges. Despite their tireless work, not all knowledge could be preserved. How many ideas, insights, or entire disciplines were lost simply because a scroll decayed, a city fell, or a scribe miscopied a passage? Alexandria's library, immense though it was, remained fragile. A reminder that human effort, however careful, is always subject to forces beyond control. The scribe's work was a quiet defiance of impermanence, an ongoing commitment to the preservation of thought in a world prone to oblivion. As the sun rises fully, casting golden light over Alexandria, the scribes finally rest. Their lamps extinguished, their pens laid down. They leave behind scrolls that will educate, inspire, and guide generations yet to come. In the silence that follows, one can almost feel the weight of accumulated human knowledge, painstakingly copied and protected by hands that history often forgets in reflecting on their contribution. We are reminded that history is not shaped solely by celebrated figures, grand battles, or monumental architecture. It is also shaped by the quiet, persistent efforts of those who labor unseen, whose dedication ensures that wisdom, insight, and culture survive the passage of time. The scribes of Alexandria, working in shadows among stacks of fragile scrolls, embody a profound truth. Enduring legacy often grows from unnoticed diligence, careful repetition, and a steadfast commitment to preserving what matters most. Long before Rome became a city of marble temples, bustling forums, and magnificent monuments, it was defined by something far less glamorous but equally enduring: its roads. Stretching across the Italian peninsula and eventually throughout an empire that spanned continents, these roads were not created overnight or through grand gestures. They were the result of patient, methodical work by laborers whose lives were defined by repetition, precision, and endurance. Without these roads, the Roman military, trade, and communication networks would have faltered, and the empire itself might have been inconceivable. The construction of a Roman road began with careful surveying. Surveyors, using rudimentary tools like the groma and corybates, measured straight lines across hills, valleys, and rivers. Their work demanded focus and a steady hand. Even a minor misalignment could force years of adjustment. The laborers who followed the surveyors did not move quickly. They dug trenches by hand, laid foundations of sand, gravel, and stone, and carefully tamped each layer to create stability. Unlike the grand arches of aqueducts or the ornate statues of the Forum, the road's beauty was in its durability, a quiet elegance born of precision and patience. Laborers used a combination of techniques honed over generations. Large stones were cut and fitted to form a base. Smaller stones and gravel were layered on top, and finally, flat paving stones created a smooth, enduring surface. Each step required attention to detail. Slopes had to be calculated to allow for drainage. Stones had to interlock securely to prevent shifting, and materials had to be sourced locally or transported from distant quarries. Mistakes were costly, and corrections required additional labor, often extending construction for months or even years. Workers often lived near the roads under construction, forming temporary settlements at the edges of the empire. These were humble places marked by dust, noise, and long hours. Daily life was repetitive: digging, lifting, placing, and leveling, day after day, week after week. Supervisors oversaw the work, ensuring that standards were met and that laborers maintained a steady pace. The effort was physically demanding, yet it was the accumulation of these small, disciplined acts that gave rise to structures that could withstand centuries. The roads served multiple functions beyond facilitating military movement. Merchants relied on them to transport goods, grain from Sicily, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, linking distant provinces in a vast economic network. Messages and decrees traveled along these roads, enabling the Senate and emperors to govern territories far beyond Rome itself. Travelers, soldiers, and citizens alike depended on the durability and consistency of these routes, often unaware of the human effort required to maintain them. One particularly slow and deliberate aspect of road construction was the attention to drainage. Engineers designed subtle cambering, creating a gentle slope from the center to the edges, ensuring that rainwater did not pool and damage the stone surface. Culverts and drains were installed where necessary, often hidden beneath the surface, their complexity unnoticed by the casual traveler. Such details reflect an understanding of not only engineering but also patience, a willingness to invest labor in unseen work, protect the road for decades. The lives of the laborers were governed by these rhythms. Meals were simple and repetitive. Clothing was practical. Rest was taken when shadows fell across the trenches and stones. Their days were measured in tasks completed rather than accolades received. Yet their labor, though monotonous, had a profound impact. Without their painstaking work, armies would be slowed, trade would falter, and the empire's cohesion might crumble. In this sense, the boring details of construction were, paradoxically, the backbone of imperial power. Even maintenance required ongoing diligence. Roads were inspected and repaired regularly. Stones shifted over time, surfaces eroded, and seasonal weather imposed where skilled workers returned repeatedly to ensure that the roads remained functional. The continuity of effort, not the grandeur of individual achievement, guaranteed the road's longevity. Through their repetition, these workers became invisible custodians of an enduring network that shaped the history of Rome and the territories it controlled. And yet, there is a lingering question. How many of the people who built and maintained these roads went unrecorded in history? How much of Rome's expansion and consolidation depended on unseen labor, on steady hands and patient endurance, rather than the celebrated strategies of generals and the decrees of emperors? The answer is largely lost, yet the roads themselves remain silent monuments to lives of quiet, relentless work. As the sun climbs higher over the Roman countryside, the work of constructing roads continues with a rhythm that is almost meditative in its repetition. Each laborer knows his place in the chain. Some dig and level the earth, others haul gravel or position large stones, while a select few, skilled in measurement and alignment, ensure that the course of the road remains true. There is no rush. Speed is secondary to durability. The work requires focus, cooperation, and an understanding that the small gestures, tamping a stone, leveling a trench, adjusting a slope, accumulate into something far larger than any individual contribution. Surveyors and engineers often walked the length of the road daily, their eyes sweeping across the surface for subtle irregularities. Even the smallest deviation could later evolve into erosion, puddles, or uneven wear that would compromise the road's function. Laborers learned to anticipate the demands of both stone and landscape, adjusting placement and depth with practiced intuition. The interplay between human effort and the natural world was constant. Soft soil had to be compacted. Slopes had to respect drainage. Stones had to be cut to size to fit the contours of hills and valleys. In this slow dialogue with nature, the worker's skill was tested and refined. Daily routines were rigid but adaptive. Mornings often began with preparation. Tools were checked, stones were inspected, and teams were assigned to specific segments. Midday brought the harsh sun, requiring laborers to rest in the shade, drink water, and plan the next steps. Evenings were filled with minor corrections or preparations for the following day. It was a repetitive cycle, seemingly mundane, yet it was through this repetition that consistency and longevity were achieved. The road, though silent and uncelebrated, was the product of countless hours of disciplined effort. The social structure among the workers was subtle yet important. Skilled masons and engineers guided less experienced laborers, teaching them the techniques necessary for accurate stone placement and compaction. Apprenticeship was hands-on and immediate. Mistakes were corrected on the spot, not for punishment, but to ensure the integrity of the work. Teams often developed a tacit communication, a shared understanding of rhythm and process that allowed large projects to proceed smoothly despite the absence of overt supervision at every moment. Beyond the physical labor, logistics played a crucial role. Stones and gravel had to be transported from quarries, sometimes over miles of uneven terrain. Animals such as oxen or mules assisted in hauling, but coordination was still necessary to prevent delays or accidents. The sourcing and movement of materials was a slow, continuous effort that required foresight, patience, and careful planning. The road's construction was as much a matter of supply management as it was of engineering skill. The roads themselves, once completed, revealed the intricacy of this labor. The multiple layers stamen, rudis, nucleus, and summum dorsum provided stability, drainage, and resilience. Each layer demanded a different technique, a different approach to compaction and leveling. While travelers saw only a smooth surface, the underlying complexity was invisible, a testament to the meticulous planning and repetitive labor of countless hands. Maintenance continued the cycle. Workers patched cracks, reset stones, and monitored erosion, ensuring that centuries-old roads remained functional. Importantly, the construction of these roads illustrates a broader lesson about human effort and endurance. In the grandeur of the empire, the focus often falls on emperors, generals, and battles. Yet the roads themselves, silent and enduring, shaped the empire more profoundly than any single act of conquest. Movement, communication, and trade all depended on these slow-built structures. The empire's cohesion rested upon the consistent, often boring, work of those who laid stone by stone, trench by trench, day after day. The laborers also left subtle cultural traces in their work. Some stones bore inscriptions or marks identifying the quarry, the builder, or the overseeing official. Others revealed small innovations, slightly better drainage here, a smoother surface there. These tiny details, unnoticed by most travelers, accumulated into a legacy of engineering excellence that influenced road building for centuries. The meticulous nature of the work ensured not only functional durability, but also a quiet transmission of technical knowledge. And yet, a question persists: how many workers' names, efforts, and innovations have been lost to time? How many lives were devoted to this monotonous, uncelebrated labor, shaping the empire's infrastructure without ever appearing in the historical record? Their contribution is largely invisible, yet it remains encoded in the very stones that stretch across continents. The Romans' ability to govern and expand relied on these unseen hands as much as on the strategies of generals and the decrees of emperors. By the time the evening shadows stretch across the Roman countryside, the day's labor comes to a quiet close. Laborers have tamped the final layers of stone, checked the alignments, and ensured that slopes are precise for drainage. Their work, repetitive and physically demanding, has contributed to a network that will endure for centuries, guiding armies, merchants, and travelers long after the builders themselves are forgotten. These roads, silent yet indispensable, exemplify how ordinary, methodical labor can shape history in ways far more enduring than the grandeur of a single battle or the fame of a ruler. The significance of Roman roads extends beyond immediate functionality. They connected cities, provinces, and distant territories, allowing ideas, culture, and commerce to flow. A farmer in Gaul could send grain to Rome. A messenger could carry imperial decrees swiftly across vast distances. Soldiers could be mobilized efficiently to quell uprisings or defend borders. All of this depended on careful preparation, precise execution, and ongoing maintenance and network sustained by hands that history rarely remembers. Even small details mattered profoundly. The correct placement of a single stone could prevent erosion. The precise slope of a segment could prevent flooding during heavy rains. Culverts and drains, often hidden beneath the road's surface, preserved the integrity of entire routes. These aspects, unnoticed by travelers who walked, rode, or drove carts along the road, reflected an understanding of materials, terrain, and human use that was passed down through apprenticeships. The laborers' repetitive, careful work ensured that these roads did not merely exist, they endured. Maintenance was equally critical. Roads were not static achievements. They required regular attention to remain functional. Stones shifted under weight, surfaces wore down, and the effects of weather demanded constant repair. Teams returned repeatedly, repairing, leveling, and replacing materials with the same meticulous attention that had marked their initial construction. Through this ongoing, often monotonous diligence, the Roman road network persisted, sometimes for centuries, sustaining the empire's lifeblood. The legacy of these builders is a lesson in persistence and humility. Their work was rarely recorded in history books. Their names are almost entirely unknown. Yet, without them, the achievements of generals, administrators, and emperors would have been constrained by geography and logistics. The empire's expansion relied not only on strategy, but on a foundation of repetitive, skilled labor. Each road represents countless hours of human effort, patience, and quiet determination, reminder that the extraordinary often rests on the ordinary. The roads also reveal the cultural dimension of labor. Inscriptions, mile markers, and subtle construction techniques provide evidence of ingenuity and foresight. Small innovations, learned and adapted over generations, traveled along with the roads themselves, disseminating technical knowledge throughout the empire. The builders' work, though often invisible, carried forward the wisdom of those who had labored before them, preserving a legacy of craftsmanship, organization, and problem-solving. Yet, as enduring as these roads were, history reminds us that even the most carefully constructed systems are vulnerable. Wars, neglect, and natural disasters could damage or destroy them. Many laborers' lives ended without recognition, their contributions absorbed into the very earth they worked so meticulously to shape. And still, the surviving stretches, worn smooth by centuries of use, testify to human resilience, patience, and the quiet power of ordinary labor. one cannot help but reflect how many civilizations might have faltered or failed had such attention to detail and methodical perseverance been absent. How much of Rome's ability to govern and sustain itself depended not on the actions of its elite, but on the repeated, disciplined work of countless hands, laying stone, tamping earth, and ensuring drainage? The answer, though largely unrecorded, is written in the roads themselves. History, then, is not solely the story of battles, rulers, and monuments. It is also the story of unseen diligence, of laborers who transform landscapes and sustain empires without acclaim. The slow builders of the Roman roads exemplify this truth, their quiet persistence. Day after day, stone by stone, created a network that shaped commerce, warfare, and culture across an empire. In the end, it is the invisible, patient, and repetitive work of ordinary individuals that often leaves the most lasting mark on the world. In the heart of pre-Columbian Texcoco, within the fertile valleys of the Basin of Mexico, there existed gardens unlike any other in the known world. These were the gardens of Nezahualcóyotl, the philosopher, king, poet, and ruler whose intellect and vision shaped not only the political landscape, but also the aesthetic and spiritual life of his city. Unlike the sprawling temples or bustling markets that defined the outer city, Nezahualcóyotl's gardens were quiet, contemplative spaces where water, stone, and flora were arranged with careful deliberation. They were not designed for spectacle, but for reflection, thought, and the subtle interplay of nature and human order. The gardens were a blend of utility and artistry. Terraces, meticulously built with stone retaining walls, allowed water to cascade gently from one level to the next, creating both irrigation and a soothing, auditory experience. Pools and canals reflected the sky, trees, and statues, giving the illusion that the heavens themselves had descended into the gardens. Plants were chosen not only for their beauty, but for their fragrance, their texture, and even their symbolic significance. Every arrangement was purposeful. Flowers that opened at dawn, reeds that whispered with the wind, and fruit trees whose abundance reflected both the prosperity of the city and the careful management of its resources. Construction of the gardens was painstaking. Workers quarried stones, shaped them into terraces, and positioned them with careful attention to slope and alignment. Water channels were carved into the earth and reinforced with masonry to prevent leakage, ensuring that the delicate balance of irrigation was maintained. Gardeners planted and pruned in accordance with seasonal cycles, observing the growth of each plant, adjusting spacing and placement to maximize harmony and aesthetic appeal. In these details, imperceptible to the casual visitor, was embedded a philosophy of life that order, patience, and careful observation could transform ordinary materials into a space of contemplation and learning. Nezahualcóyotl himself was deeply involved in the design and maintenance of these gardens. Though the laborers carried out the physical work, the king's vision guided every element. He saw the gardens as more than ornamentation. They were expressions of cosmic order, reflections of philosophical principles, and spaces for quiet meditation. Statues of deities, animals, and mythic figures were placed strategically to guide the viewer's gaze, creating sequences of discovery that unfolded slowly as one walked along the terraces. Water features were timed to catch the morning light, producing reflections that shifted with the day. offering subtle lessons in impermanence and observation. The gardens also had practical purposes. Agricultural terraces provided a source of food, demonstrating how beauty and utility could coexist. Plants were selected for both aesthetic and nutritional value, reflecting an understanding of ecology and human need. Maintenance, routines, pruning, weeding, irrigation were carried out daily, requiring patience, consistency, and attention to detail. Though seemingly mundane, these tasks ensured the garden's longevity and the city's sustainability, blending philosophical ideals with pragmatic concerns. Visitors to the garden's advisors, scholars, and select citizens would find themselves immersed in a space where every element had meaning. The sound of water over stone, the careful alignment of pathways, and the gentle rustle of leaves created an atmosphere of calm contemplation. Quetzalcoatl encouraged reflection on life, mortality, and governance, using the gardens as both a pedagogical and spiritual tool. Unlike the crowded plazas or the noisy markets, the gardens were places of quiet learning, where the ordinary details of stone, water, and plant life carried lessons about patience, order, and beauty. Yet, for all their meticulous design, the gardens were not static. Seasons changed the appearance and feel of each terrace. Rain altered the flow of canals. Sunlight shifted reflections across pools. Workers adapted continuously, pruning, repairing, and adjusting to maintain both functionality and aesthetic harmony. These adjustments were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they were crucial to the garden's enduring effect. In this interplay of constancy and change, one glimpses a profound understanding of balance, rhythm, and the impermanence inherent in all things, even more than physical labor. The gardens reflect a philosophy of observation. Quetzalcoatl and his gardeners watched patterns of growth, migration of birds, shifts in water, and changes in light. Each observation informed subsequent interventions, demonstrating a methodical approach to learning from nature itself. This quiet, iterative process reveals a blend of science, artistry, and meditation rarely celebrated in histories of empire, yet fundamental to the intellectual and aesthetic life of Texcoco. And so, as you imagine walking through the terraces, hearing the gentle trickle of water, observing statues half hidden among flowers, you are invited into a world where patience, order, and quiet labor shape experience. Yet an unresolved thought lingers. How much of Quetzalcoatl's philosophical insight was born from these gardens? Did the careful observation of water, stone, and plant life guide his poetry and governance in ways that remain invisible to history? Could the legacy of his city, in subtle ways, be traced as much to quiet terraces and canals as to battles, laws, or speeches? As the afternoon sun casts long shadows across the terraces of Texcoco, the gardens of Quetzalcoatl achieve a calm stillness, a moment when labor pauses and contemplation emerges. Workers rest, water flows quietly through channels, and leaves rustle gently in the breeze. These gardens, though physically grounded in stone, soil, and water, exist also as expressions of thought, philosophy, and careful observation. Every element, the alignment of stones, the path of water, the placement of tresser reflects a deliberate intention to create a space where reflection is as vital as beauty. and where patience and care define the human experience. The legacy of the gardens is inseparable from the people who maintained them. Laborers who spent years shaping terraces, pruning trees, and managing irrigation were as much part of the garden as the stone and flora themselves. Their repetitive, uncelebrated work ensured that the vision of the philosopher king endured. Over time, the gardens became not merely a private pleasure, but a cultural touchstone, a demonstration that sustained effort, observation, and attention to minute details could produce spaces that fostered learning, reflection, and aesthetic appreciation. Water, moving tirelessly from terrace to terrace, embodies both literal and metaphorical continuity. It nourishes plants, supports the structure of terraces, and offers reflections that invite introspection. Observers, whether Nezahualcóyotl himself or a visiting scholar, could see in the water a mirror of their own thoughts, the flow of ideas, and the passage of time. The repetition inherent in the management of these channels, daily inspection, adjustment, and care mirrored the philosophical rhythms that guided the king's life: order, observation, and contemplation. The gardens also reveal an integration of utility and artistry rarely celebrated in historical accounts. Fruit trees produced sustenance, herbs offered medicinal value, and decorative plants enhanced the sensory experience. Terraces prevented soil erosion, while pathways and steps guided visitors through both physical and intellectual landscapes. In this interplay of function and beauty, the work of gardeners became philosophical practice. Each repetitive act of pruning, watering, and adjusting contributed to a greater, enduring whole. Maintenance and observation were continuous. Seasons changed the garden's character. Rains swelled pools, sunlight shifted reflections, and new growth altered the visual balance. Gardeners adapted to these shifts, refining terraces, redirecting water, and pruning plants to maintain harmony. Their work was never complete. It demanded patience and attentiveness, a quiet diligence that ensured the garden's longevity and the persistence of its guiding philosophy. Visitors often left the gardens with subtle insights that endured long after their walk among the terraces. A carefully observed reflection, the sound of water cascading over stone, or the alignment of a statue against a flowering backdrop, could inspire thoughts about life, impermanence, or governance. Knowledge, poetry, and philosophy were transmitted not only through spoken words or written texts, but also through these carefully curated physical experiences. The gardens, in essence, became an experiential library, preserved through repetition, observation, and quiet labor. And yet, even as these spaces endured, history remains silent on many details. The identities of the gardeners, the choices of individual stones or plantings, the countless small decisions made daily are largely lost to us. Their names are absent, their acts uncelebrated, yet their labor shaped Texcoco's intellectual and aesthetic landscape as profoundly as the king's decrees or poetry. It is a reminder that the quiet, repetitive, and often invisible work of ordinary individuals forms the foundation of enduring legacies. In contemplating these gardens, one is left with a final reflection. Human ingenuity and persistence often manifest in the mundane, repetitive, and unseen. The terraces, statues, pools, and carefully chosen plants of Nezahualcoyotl's gardens endure not because of grandeur or spectacle, but because of attention, care, and patience practiced daily over years. They remind us that history is composed as much of quiet diligence and methodical labor as of dramatic events or celebrated figures. And so, the question lingers: how many of our most enduring cultural achievements, our philosophies, arts, and scientific discoveries rest upon the quiet, repetitive acts of those whose names will never be recorded? In the gardens of Nezahualcoyotl, the answer is reflected in water, stone, and leaves, whispering across centuries that the ordinary, when practiced with care and purpose, shapes the extraordinary. As the morning sun rises over Texcoco, the gardens of Nezahualcoyotl awaken to a rhythm known only to those who tend them. Laborers move silently along terraces, adjusting stones, clearing debris, and checking irrigation channels. Their work is methodical and deliberate, measured in gestures repeated day after day, season after season. While the outer city hums with commerce, political debates, and ritual celebrations, these gardeners perform a quieter service. They sustain not only the gardens themselves, but the philosophical and aesthetic vision of the philosopher king. Water is the lifeblood of the gardens, and its management requires constant attention. Channels carved from stone carry it from reservoirs and natural springs, feeding pools, fountains, and terraced beds. Even slight variations in flow could disturb the balance, leaving some plants parched and others flooded. Gardeners monitor these channels with practiced eyes, adjusting sluices, clearing blockages, and ensuring that each terrace receives exactly the right amount of moisture. This labor, repetitive yet critical, underscores the interplay between human diligence and natural systems that defines the gardens. Pruning and planting follow a similarly exacting pattern. Fruit trees, flowers, and shrubs are inspected daily. Leaves are trimmed to maintain form, branches guided to avoid obstruction, and soil amended to support growth. Laborers observe subtle changes, signs of disease, insect damage, or nutrient deficiency, intervene gently but decisively. This continuous attention, often unnoticed by those passing through the gardens, ensures that the aesthetic and functional qualities envisioned by Nezahualcoyotl are maintained. Every detail, no matter how small, contributes to the harmony of the whole. Stonework, too, demands ongoing care. Terraces, retaining walls, and pathways must withstand the effects of weather, erosion, and the weight of visitors. Workers replace or reset stones as needed, maintaining level surfaces and structural stability. Even minor misalignments can affect water flow, plant health, and the overall visual composition of the gardens. Here, the labor is physical but also intellectual. Workers learn to anticipate how materials interact with environmental forces, applying subtle adjustments that ensure longevity without disrupting the carefully orchestrated design. Nezahualcoyotl himself often walked among the terraces, observing, instructing, and contemplating. His presence was subtle but significant, a suggestion here, a correction there, guiding the work without disrupting the rhythm of the gardeners. These interactions were less about control and more about shared understanding, a transmission of philosophy through action and observation. In a sense, the gardens became a classroom without walls, teaching lessons in patience, balance, an attentive care through lived experience rather than words alone. The gardens also functioned as a social and cultural space, though in a measured way. Scholars, advisors, and select visitors were invited to wander the terraces, observe the reflections in pools, and meditate on the alignment of stone and plant. Here, the interplay of utility, beauty, and reflection was most apparent. Terraces that produced food also pleased the eye. Water channels that nourished crops also carried a soothing sound. Statues and architectural elements guided the gaze, encouraging thought and introspection. Each sensory experience was a subtle instruction, a quiet reinforcement of the principles of order and harmony that underpinned both the gardens and the governance of TEXCOCO. Apprenticeship and mentorship were integral to maintaining the gardens. Younger workers learned by observing and repeating the careful routines of their elders, how to shape stone, manage water, prune plants, and anticipate environmental changes. Over years, repetition became mastery, and knowledge was transmitted quietly from hand to hand. Unlike grand scholarly treatises, this education was embodied, learned through practice, and sustained over decades. It was invisible to the casual observer, yet critical to the garden's enduring legacy. Even the smallest details carried meaning. The placement of a single stone, the timing of a water release, or the arrangement of a flowering plant. These decisions were guided by experience, observation, and a sensitivity to the interplay of natural and human-made elements. Such subtleties, though often unnoticed, defined the character of the gardens and the experience of those who walked among them. And yet, a question remains, quietly unresolved. How much of Quetzalcoatl's wisdom, his poetry, laws, and philosophical insights, did the slow rhythms of tending stone and water, the quiet observations of plant and light, shape his understanding of life, governance, and mortality? Could the essence of Texcoco's intellectual and cultural achievements be traced, in part, to these ordinary, repetitive acts carried out in the service of beauty, order, and contemplation? In the winding canals and narrow alleyways of Venice, there exists a world of subtlety, anonymity, and quiet artistry. The city is renowned for its grand masquerades, sumptuous balls, and the theatrical display of wealth and status. Yet beneath the glittering surface lies a quieter, often overlooked reality. The ordinary Venetians who interacted with masks not for spectacle, but as an essential part of daily life. It was in this world that mask makers like Pietro Bellini plied their trade, shaping not only objects of artistry, but also instruments that allowed individuals to navigate the complexities of Venetian society. Pietro Bellini's workshop, tucked in a narrow cale off the Grand Canal, was modest but meticulously organized. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each holding a variety of masks in different stages of completion. Papyra, MCH, clay, leather, and paint were carefully stored, and the air was filled with a mixture of glue, damp pulp, and the faint aroma of oil paints. Workbenches bore the marks of years, indentations from carving tools, streaks of color, and the occasional burn from a heated iron used to shape delicate forms. The workshop was quiet, except for the soft scraping of tools, the occasional thud of a mallet, and the murmur of conversations between apprentice and master. The process of mask making was deliberate and meticulous. Each mask began with a core of papier-mâché, layered thinly to achieve both strength and lightness. Once dry, the mask was sanded smooth, painted, and decorated with simple or elaborate features depending on the commission. While the city's elite often demanded ornate designs with gold leaf, intricate patterns, and delicate feathers, ordinary customers had more practical needs. Masks were worn to conceal identity, to navigate social tensions, or simply to enjoy moments of private amusement in public spaces. Even the simplest mask required skill, proper fit, balance, and comfort were essential for the wearer's confidence and freedom of movement. Customers were diverse in both purpose and temperament. Merchants sought masks to shield their transactions from gossip. Artisans wore them during civic celebrations. Lovers traded glances beneath carefully molded visages. Pietro Bellini, with his keen eye and patient hands, learned to read the unspoken requirements of each client. A slight curve in the lips might signal a wish for discretion. The width of the eyes could indicate a desire for visibility, while remaining incognito. Every mask was a subtle negotiation between material, purpose, and personality. Work in the workshop was repetitive, yet intellectually engaging. Apprentices learned not just techniques of molding, sanding, and painting, but also the social subtleties that defined Venetian life. Understanding who might wear a mask, in what context, and to what end became as important as mastering the craft. The rhythm of production layering, paper, MCH, drying, painting, decorating allowed the artisans to focus both on skill and on observation, honing their craft while maintaining awareness of the city's social fabric. The masks themselves were more than objects of concealment. They were instruments of social navigation. In a city where class, politics, and personal vendettas could make daily life precarious, a well-crafted mask provided safety, anonymity, and agency. The ordinary Venetians who walked the streets with these creations could interact freely, speak, and act in ways that might have been impossible without this quiet form of disguise. In this sense, the masks were both tools and companions, silent partners in the rhythm of daily life. Behind the scenes, Pietro Bellini maintained meticulous records. Lists of commissions, notes on materials, sketches of designs, all were carefully archived. The workshop itself became a repository of social knowledge: which masks were popular, which designs were most effective, and which combinations of materials and forms produced the greatest comfort and concealment. In the repetition of production and careful observation of customers, the artisans became chroniclers of ordinary Venetian life, their masks acting as tangible evidence of social dynamics that often went unnoticed in historical accounts. Yet, for all its quiet labor, the workshop was also a place of subtle artistry. Even when serving ordinary clients, Pietro and his apprentices experimented with patterns, textures, and minor decorative flourishes. A small swirl of color here, a faint relief there, these touches elevated the functional mask into an object of personal expression. While the city celebrated grand masquerades in public squares, the real artistry existed in these quieter moments, shaped for the individuals who required anonymity, discretion, or the pleasure of simple transformation. And so, one must wonder, in a city famous for spectacle, how much of Venice's social structure relied not on nobility or politics, but on the careful, repetitive work of artisans creating everyday masks for ordinary people. How many interactions, hidden stories, or minor but consequential decisions were shaped by these unassuming creations? Could it be that the invisible infrastructure of anonymity and discretion, facilitated by masks, played as crucial a role in Venetian life as the grand ceremonies celebrated in the piazzas? As twilight settles over Venice, the canals glow with reflections of lanterns and the distant shimmer of the lagoon. The city's streets are quieter now, but the effects of the day's work in workshops like Pietro Bellini's remain visible in the movement of masked figures across bridges, through marketplaces, and along narrow alleys. Each mask, carefully constructed and worn, has facilitated countless interactions, enabling conversation, commerce, private amusement, and cautious discretion. The labor that produced them, repetitive and often unseen, has shaped the rhythm and texture of daily Venetian life in subtle but profound ways. By the end of the day, Pietro and his apprentices catalog completed masks, inspect materials, and plan for the next commissions. Some masks were ornate, destined for minor civic celebrations or private gatherings. Others were simple, designed for concealment or practicality. Regardless of design, each carried the imprint of care, observation, and repeated attention. The workshop, modest and unassuming, functioned as a hub where ordinary labor intertwined with social necessity and quiet artistry, producing objects that were both functional and expressive. Masks, though often invisible in historical narratives, were instruments of agency. They allowed ordinary Venetians to navigate a complex social landscape with greater freedom to speak, trade, flirt, or participate in civic life without fear of undue scrutiny. They mediated identity, negotiating between public expectation and private desire. In this sense, the repetitive, detailed work of artisans like Pietro Bellini was integral to the functioning of society itself. Social interactions, seemingly spontaneous, depended upon these carefully crafted facades. The craft of mask-making also carried lessons in discipline, foresight, and subtle communication. Apprentices who spent months or years mastering the layering of papier-mâché, the shaping of delicate forms, and the careful application of paint developed skills that went beyond manual dexterity. They learned observation, patience, and the art of anticipating human needs. The quiet, repetitive labor cultivated both technical expertise and social insight, skills that were invaluable in a city as intricate and layered as Venice. Maintenance and care extended the life of each mask. Leather straps were checked for wear, paint was retouched when necessary, and delicate decorations were repaired. Masks could be reused for years, their surfaces accumulating subtle marks and traces of human history. In this continuity, one sees not only practical craftsmanship but also a small form of legacy, the ongoing influence of the artisan's careful hands on the everyday life of the city. Each mask becomes an artifact of social function, discreetly recording the intersection of labor, art, and human interaction. Even the smallest, seemingly insignificant details mattered. A precisely cut eye hole could prevent detection. A faint curve in the lips could convey neutrality or discretion. The weight of the mask could determine hours of comfortable wear. Such nuances required attention, repetition, and meticulous adjustment. They were the invisible architecture of social life, shaping interactions in ways that left no written record but were felt daily in marketplaces, streets, and homes. And yet, despite their ubiquity, these laborers and their creations are often absent from the chronicles of Venice. The public remembers the grand masquerades, the political intrigues, and the pageantry of the elite. But the ordinary craftsmen who enabled everyday life, who provided tools for discretion, play, and social survival, are rarely celebrated. Their impact is encoded in social functioning itself, an enduring but largely invisible legacy. One is left with a final reflection: how many societies rely, in subtle ways, on the repetitive, unseen labor of artisans and workers who ensure that daily life flows smoothly? How many interactions, decisions, and even historical events are quietly shaped by the skill, patience, and careful observation of those whose names remain unrecorded? In Venice, the masks of ordinary citizens reveal the answer. The extraordinary often rests upon the ordinary, and history is as much about invisible hands as it is about visible spectacle. In the heart of medieval Europe, every town and village relied upon a network of stone towers, rising silently above narrow streets and bustling marketplaces. These bell towers, though unassuming in daily attention, served as essential instruments of communal life. They marked the passage of hours, announced the beginning of work and rest, called villagers to prayer, and signaled danger. Remarkably influential, yet their story is largely a tale of quiet, methodical labor. Construction began with the careful selection of stone. Builders quarried local limestone, sandstone, or granite, depending on availability, then transported massive blocks over rough roads, often using sledges, oxen, and sheer human effort. Stones were shaped with chisels and hammers, each strike deliberate, removing only a small portion at a time. The repetition of labor was both meditative and necessary. A single miscut stone could compromise the tower's stability, threatening collapse. Apprentices and masons worked together in a rhythm that combined force, patience, and precision, transforming raw rock into vertical monuments of order. Foundations were the most critical aspect of construction. Builders dug deep trenches, filling them with compacted stone and mortar to prevent settling. Medieval knowledge of soil and load distribution was rudimentary but effective. Master builders learned through experience which types of ground could support the weight of towers and which required reinforcement. The repetition of measuring, leveling, and testing ensured that each base could endure centuries of weather, vibration, and the dynamic forces exerted by massive swinging bells. The structure rose slowly, layer by layer. Each course of stone was placed with careful attention to alignment and verticality. Scaffolding, often wooden and precarious, allowed workers to reach higher levels, yet demanded constant vigilance. Workers relied on plumb lines, measuring rods, and simple sighting methods to maintain precision. Every step required coordination. The rhythm of hoisting, setting, and securing stones became a silent choreography of labor that transformed raw materials into enduring architecture. Once the tower reached a sufficient height, the bell chamber was constructed. Here, timbers had to be perfectly aligned to support the weight and movement of enormous bells. Carpenters, masons, and engineers collaborated closely, each relying on the repetitive, disciplined work of the others to achieve harmony. The final placement of the bell was a delicate operation. Massive bronze objects had to be lifted, suspended, and tested without damaging the surrounding stonework. Inside the tower, wooden stairs, ladders, and platforms were constructed to allow access to the bells. These features required careful planning, balancing safety, durability, and accessibility. Laborers, using basic hand tools, spent weeks or even months shaping and fitting timber to precise specifications. The repetition of these tasks, while tedious, ensured that the structure was safe and functional for decades to come. Every nail, joint, and brace reflected accumulated knowledge passed down from generations of builders. The social role of bell towers extended far beyond architecture. Bells regulated the rhythms of everyday life. They marked canonical hours for prayer, the opening and closing of markets, and times for curfew. Sound of bells provided the only reliable measure of time. The repetitive tolling became a shared pulse, uniting the lives of townspeople across generations. Maintenance was a continuous, often invisible task. Stones eroded, mortars weakened, and timbers rotted. Bells required tuning and occasionally recasting. Workers climbed towers regularly, inspecting, repairing, and reinforcing. These acts, though largely unnoticed by ordinary citizens, ensured that towers remained functional and resilient. In essence, bell towers were sustained not only by initial construction, but by ongoing, repetitive labor that preserved their social and temporal role. Yet, for all their significance, the builders of these towers are rarely remembered. Names are lost, hands uncredited, and yet their work shaped daily life in tangible ways. Every village bell, every rhythmic toll, depended upon the skill, patience, and diligence of those who labored for months or years in silence. These towers are monuments not to glory or conquest, but to the enduring impact of quiet, methodical work. And so, as you imagine the bell ringing across the fields, echoing through narrow streets, you are invited to reflect how many daily routines, community interactions, and even historical events were governed not by rulers or generals, but by the careful, repetitive work of those who built and maintained these silent stone sentinels. How much of medieval life was shaped by these unnoticed structures, whose steady presence punctuated the passage of time for generations. Morning light spills across the village square, illuminating the towering presence of stone above the rooftops. Within the bell tower, laborers and apprentices continue the repetitive yet precise work that sustains both the structure and the life it governs. Maintenance, though less glamorous than initial construction, is no less critical. Mortar is checked for cracks, loose stones are reset, and timbers are examined for rot or insect damage. Each action is measured and deliberate, requiring patience and a steady hand. Repetition is not monotony. It is the foundation of reliability, ensuring that the tower remains a dependable marker of time and social order. Workers move in a quiet rhythm dictated by the constraints of materials, weather, and human strength. Stone must be hoisted carefully, preventing cracks or chips. Timber must be aligned precisely, often under precarious conditions. This repetition trains the body and the mind, creating a workforce capable of sustaining structures that will endure for decades, sometimes centuries. Mastery emerges from the ordinary, repeated acts of placement, measurement, and adjustment. Inside the bell chamber, carpenters and masons coordinate closely. Massive bells, heavy with bronze, require exact calculations for support beams, suspension ropes, and mechanisms for ringing. Workers test swings, adjust braces, and listen carefully for tonal irregularities. The repetitive testing and adjustment ensure that the bells ring clearly, consistently, and without damage to the surrounding stone. In this way, repetitive labor directly supports the social function of the bell, accurate timekeeping, community coordination, and alerting the populace to both celebration and danger. The tower also serves as a stage for apprenticeship and knowledge transfer. Younger workers observe seasoned builders, repeating the same motions and internalizing the principles of balance, weight distribution, and sound. Through observation and repeated practice, apprentices learn not only technical skill but also judgment, how to respond to irregularities, when to reinforce, and how to predict structural stress. Knowledge is embedded in action, transmitted quietly across generations, and preserved in the tower itself. Outside the walls, the bell tolls punctuate daily life. Villagers, guided by its sound, regulate work, prayer, and rest. Market activity begins and ends according to its rhythm. Travelers navigate unfamiliar streets by listening for familiar chimes. Emergencies are signaled and communal rituals are orchestrated. The repetition of sound mirrors the repetition of labor. Both create a predictable structure upon which human life relies. The rhythm of labor within the tower translates into a rhythm of life across the village. Even minor maintenance challenges reveal the importance of persistence. Each issue demands careful intervention. Workers repeat measurements, adjust supports, and retest stability. The process may appear tedious, yet it preserves the tower's function. The extraordinary endurance of these towers is a direct product of such repetitive, meticulous labor. And yet, for all their significance, the human stories behind these towers remain largely unrecorded. The faces of masons, carpenters, and apprentice individuals who devoted years to ensuring the reliability of these structures have been lost to time. Their work, however, resonates daily in the tolling of bells, in the structured flow of village life, and in the silent endurance of the towers themselves. These ordinary, persistent laborers created an infrastructure that shaped society as profoundly as any written law or grand architectural monument. One is left to wonder how much of medieval Europe's daily life, social cohesion, and historical trajectory relied on these silent sentinels and the repetitive, unseen labor of those who maintained them. What other unnoticed structures and routines, quietly upheld through repetition and diligence, underpinned societies and enabled them to endure for centuries? As evening descends over the village, the last bell tolls, its deep resonance stretching across rooftops, bridges, and fields. The sound is more than a marker of time, is a testament to centuries of quiet labor, of hands that shaped stone and timber with patience and precision. The tower, rising above the everyday bustle, embodies not only architectural skill, but the persistence of human effort, repeated day after day, year after year. Each toll carries forward the invisible work of those who built and maintained it over decades. generations of laborers contributed to the tower's endurance. Apprentices became masters, imparting their knowledge to new learners, preserving methods refined through years of repetition. Every repair, adjustment, and reinforcement built upon previous work, a continuous chain of diligence connecting the labor of one generation to the next. Even minor actions, like repositioning a single stone or tightening a beam, ensured that the tower would continue to function and serve its community. In this cumulative repetition lies the essence of durability. Ordinary, consistent labor creating extraordinary longevity. The social impact of bell towers cannot be overstated. In a time without mechanical clocks, villagers relied on their tolls to organize daily routines, coordinate markets, regulate work, and maintain civic order. Bells announced celebrations, warned of danger, and summoned citizens to collective prayer. Each sound depended upon the precision and care of the unseen laborers who kept the mechanisms in perfect working order. Life in the village followed a rhythm orchestrated silently by these repetitive, disciplined acts of craftsmanship. Even more subtly, bell towers influenced culture and perception. Their visibility and sound became markers of communal identity, symbols of continuity, and anchors of memory. Travelers and traders recognized a village by the tone of its bells. Stories and rituals were punctuated by their steady rhythm, and behind every clear chime was the careful placement of stone, the exact alignment of timber, and the disciplined oversight of workers performing repetitive, unglamorous tasks. History remembers kings and battles, yet the endurance of society often rests on such invisible hands. Maintenance was a continuous, never-ending task. Stones settled, mortar eroded, wood splintered. Bells needed tuning, ropes frayed, mechanisms required adjustment. Laborers returned routinely, performing repetitive inspections and minor repairs to prevent larger failures. In doing so, they ensured that the bell tower remained reliable, functional, and safe. Their work was methodical, almost meditative, a testament to the idea that the ordinary, repeated actions of many hands can shape the extraordinary course of daily life and communal memory. And yet, for all its importance, the story of the bell tower is incomplete without reflecting on the people behind it. The masons, carpenters, apprentices, and laborers who spent decades in repetition measuring, cutting, lifting, repairing remain largely invisible to history. Their names are lost, their personal lives unrecorded, yet their work continues to resonate. Every toll, every shadow cast by stone against the square, and every step safely guided within the tower is a reminder of the enduring power of ordinary labor. As you imagine the bell ringing across empty streets, consider this: how much of society's stability, continuity, and cultural memory relies on repetitive, disciplined, and often invisible human labor. How many achievements that shape history, commerce, community, daily life rest on the unnoticed work of those whose names will never appear in chronicles or paintings. In the case of the medieval bell tower, the answer rings clear with every echo through time. The ordinary, when repeated faithfully, sustains the extraordinary. And so, as our journey through quiet histories comes to an end, we are reminded that much of what shapes the world is unseen. The careful hands of builders, gardeners, and artisans, The repetitive labor and patient attention of ordinary people, these are the threads that hold societies together. Long after the names of rulers and conquerors fade from memory, history is not only made in grand events or loud triumphs, it lives in small, deliberate actions. A stone set in a road, a tree pruned in a secret garden, a mask molded for anonymity, or a bell that marks the passage of time. In these subtle acts, we glimpse the resilience, ingenuity, and quiet persistence of humanity. So let your mind rest on these slow, enduring rhythms, and perhaps, as you drift into sleep, you may carry with you the gentle hum of history, soft, steady, and quietly remarkable.